All right, so we just saw the one and only vice presidential debate. Some quick feedback on the performances from both Tim Walz and JD Vance. I'm gonna start with JD. JD, he showed up. He was just like I thought he would be, crisp. He was informed. He was well spoken. He had some great arguments. Now, those are just some buzzwords that I'm using right now. But to talk real quick about Tim, of course, he was well rehearsed and he was also very crisp, well spoken. At the same time, kind of saw some of the elements of what we experienced with Kamala Harris was a lot of catchphrases, a lot of, like I just used with both of these guys, buzzwords, and not really a lot of analytics and actually drilling down. And we saw a tremendous amount of Donald Trump this, Donald Trump that. And it's like, well, hey, he doesn't have the job right now. What about your running mate, Kamala Harris? And he couldn't sing or even pronounce her name. So I thought that was interesting. And also to go along with it again, he did a great job of handicapping himself by making himself seem like he was going to be nervous. Now, some of that did show through though. Some of those concerned looks that he had on his face that I don't know what he was going for, but he had some looks on his face that, showed a lot of shock is what it looked like. I don't know what he was trying to, maybe show shock that he was surprised with some of the answers that he was hearing from JD, but a lot of it looked like he was shocked that he was getting put in place. And it looked also that he was doing his very best to scramble and pivot, in which some instances he did pretty well. One that I can point out is once they started talking and going down this rabbit hole of January 6th, I think both Trump and JD in their debates have said, I said peaceful, but what they haven't, and then, well, I'll give Trump his credence. He did say that he told the Secretary of State at the time, or rather the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to have some National Guardsmen put in place because there are people that are going to show up and it's going to be chaotic. Anyways, one thing that I don't think either one of them did was say the name Ashley Babbitt. And that, in the debate that we saw tonight, that rabbit hole came out of this whole notion of what protesters might do. I forget, they kind of were speaking about protesters. One, I think JD missed the opportunity to say people are protesting in your state. They burned down government buildings. People got killed. He didn't reference that. And to cross balance that with saying the only person that got killed on January 6th was Ashley Babbitt, I think would have been a good gut punch. What Walz did was at the end of JD giving his response and pretty much saying that, sure, he saw some issues with the election, which, by the way, I think neither one of them talked about in their debates, to not be too critical, but to point out some opportunities. They never talked about what's going on in Fulton County, Georgia, where they're actually finding election fraud in the 2020 election. And there was some conversation, a tremendous amount of conversation about there being fraud and how that might have moved the needle in one way or the other for Trump's position in 2020. And so for all these claims that there were no election fraud, well, they're actually investigating it right now. I feel like there's some people that are indicted. And we found that also in Harris County where there's been election fraud. So it happens. So to miss the opportunity to say that, well, to be honest with you, or to be honest, let's be honest with American people. We know that there are cases that are being litigated. We know that election fraud happens. We know that there's ballot harvesting, which isn't illegal, but it's also kind of hinges on some moral or some ethics that are unfavorable. And we know that Democrats promote that, right? And so to not speak on that, I think is a missed opportunity. But then Tim Walz kind of also said that we can see that the choice is going to be who's going to be a check and balance for Kamala Harris versus who's going to be a check and balance for Donald Trump. And JD is looking like he's not going to be a check and balance. And that's going to be the decision that we need to make for the election. It's like, no, he really should have jumped in there too also and said, no, the decision is, are we going to be letting millions of people continue to pour into our porous southern border? And are we going to continue to see the economy being disturbed because of it, and also crime spike and have illegal weapons that you folks are so on the Democratic ticket concerned about continue to pour into our country? That's the big question. And we're talking about moving forward from January 6th, where we said protest peacefully. And we also only saw one person that actually died, and that was a protester who was killed by a Capitol police officer. Had there been National Guardsmen in place to prevent the outside of the Capitol from being penetrated, we wouldn't have had Ashley Babbitt's unfortunate demise due to the hands of a Capitol police officer. The Capitol police officers that they say have died from January 6th didn't die on that day because of the wounds that were inflicted. There's other instances that caused their deaths, and those are unfortunate as well. But let's be clear, there was no attack from anyone with a firearm, and that's a interesting scenario to say that people were trying to take over the Capitol and they were unarmed, and a lot of them were retirees. So, I mean, that kind of conversation I think would be helpful. JD nailed a lot of issues. He really brought it home when it came to the child care position. I think Tim Walz was kind of reeling that, geez, they got a better offer on the table than we do. The $6,000, I tried a deeper question. One thing that I didn't point out in my prediction that I knew would have been made self-evident was that the moderators were going to do more fact checking on JD, and then they were also going to do things to kind of tee up the conversation. For Tim Walz, we saw both moderators, Norah O'Donnell and Brennan, get involved, and so that was to be expected. And I think that that's a part of it, going into these mainstream left-leaning social spheres that JD has been so brave to traverse those grounds. I think that would have been one just to easily point out that I left out. But we definitely saw, again, I think one time they actually did, though, have one position that they kind of penciled Walz in. And then also they tried to say that they didn't say he misspoke. His words were that he misspoke about going to China and being there with the guy in Tiananmen Square. But I think JD might have had an opportunity to pounce on him and say, what do you like so much about the Chinese government? And how much of that is influencing you to be involved with socialist practices in this country? But JD, again, I can't criticize the guy. He's a brave patriot going on all these interviews. We can't find Kamala Harris. Tim Walz has been a little bit more active in terms of getting in front of the camera, but he really nailed it tonight. He was, buttoned up and had a lot of great arguments. I think one that I want to draw on real quick and then I'll cut loose is when he was talking about what they're going to do in terms of energy policies and actually bringing that into the conversation in his closing arguments, where he started talking about how this inflation and the inability for us to really move our economy forward is because of these policies that are stifling the energy production in this country. So the drill baby drill is certainly a part of the economic mix in terms of actually delivering on the promises that both parties are trying to deliver on, building up the middle class and making things more affordable. I think the Walz and Harris campaign, they don't have a single notion to throw at it, because their notion is that they're going to end fracking, they're going to stop drilling, or even make it harder for energy production to be solely on the shores of our nation, and then also move folks into a position where, again, JD painted a great picture. They're pumping money into these energy policies that are propping up these countries that are producing a tremendous amount of dirty energy. And that's not only stifling economic growth, but also counterintuitive to their plans when it comes to protecting the environment. So all in all, I mean, I'm going to give the W. I'm going to give the W to JD, but I think for good reason. At the same time, Tim Walz came out with a handicap and he served above par. And so you got to give him, props for thinking to anchor himself as being nervous, but at the same time, he did, in a lot of instances, appear nervous and definitely began to flounder in some of his remarks. So hopefully you enjoyed my analysis, and hopefully you're going to get out and vote early. In Texas, you can vote on the 21st of October. So we're, 20 some odd days away, this being October 1st. And I would encourage you to get in on the first day of early voting, vote all the way down ballot Republican. And this is something that didn't get brought up either, a missed opportunity to paint this guy as, hey, you called us weird. Explain to me again. We didn't get an explanation. Maybe that's not polling very well for the whole pointing out the fact that this guy wanted tampons in the boys' restroom. We didn't hear any of that. Actually, they stayed all the way away from transgender policies altogether. And then boys and women's sports never got brought up. I think there were some ways to segue into it. Nevertheless, not sure how that's polling nationwide. Maybe that's why both candidates kind of stayed away from it. For sure, Tim Walz stayed away from it because it only sounds idiotic. I mean, in a lot of minds of most Americans, I'm sure. And also in terms of JD, if it wasn't something that was really being ushered into the conversation, why take it there if, he felt or his team felt that it wasn't worth talking about, if it wasn't pertinent again to whatever else was being discussed. So all in all, a great debate. They, on the Walz side of things, looked a lot better than what Kamala did. She did a great job of presenting a bunch of slogans. Tim kind of buttoned things up in a sense, making it look like they have more of a plan, but at the same time, still use the number one left-wing Democratic Marxist socialist strategy in this country, which is to demonize Trump, and try to gain appeal, where I think that might be wearing off for the greater American population. So again, thanks for hopping in here. And until next time, y'all take it easy, stay safe, be blessed, vote early, and I'll see you later.